The August heat in Greenwich, Connecticut felt like a suffocating blanket as I sat in that ridiculous white plastic chair they dragged out from the pool shed. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, worth more money than most people see in a lifetime, perched on a $5 chair like some kind of party crasher at my own family's mansion. My name is Nick, short for Nicole Harrison, and at 25, I should have been inside mingling with Connecticut's elite, not watching through the French doors like a kid with her nose pressed against a candy store window. My blonde hair was already starting to stick to my neck in the oppressive humidity, and I tugged at my simple black Diane von Furstenberg dress, wondering for the 100th time why I'd even bothered coming back home. The sounds of laughter and clinking crystal glasses drifted out from Dad's party, mixing with the gentle hum of the central air conditioning that I wasn't allowed to enjoy. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the glittering crowd, women in designer cocktail dresses, men in handmade suits, all of them part of the Greenwich social hierarchy that had once been my birthright. "Nikki, sweetheart, just stay out here for a bit, would you?" Mom had said 27 minutes ago. Yes, I'd been counting. Her voice dripping with that fake sweetness she reserved for when she was desperately embarrassed by me. "Your father has some very important investors here tonight from Boston and New York, and we don't want any complications." Complications. That's what I'd become to them. Not their daughter, not a successful entrepreneur, but a complication to be managed and hidden away when respectable society came calling. The backstory was simple enough, though painful in its familiarity. 3 years ago, I'd been the golden child. Yale Business School, summa cum laude from Dartmouth, engaged to Trevor Whitmore III, whose family owned half of Nantucket. I was on the prescribed path, finished the MBA, marry well, join Dad's construction empire as a token executive, produce grandchildren, and play tennis at the country club until I died. But then I'd discovered something that changed everything. During my internship at a logistics company in Hartford, I'd noticed inefficiencies in their supply chain management that were costing them millions annually. More importantly, I'd figured out how technology could solve these problems in ways that traditional business consulting never could. I'd tried to explain my ideas to Dad over dinner one night. "The construction industry is ripe for disruption," I'd told him excitedly. "Imagine if you could optimize your supply chains, predict material needs, coordinate subcontractors, all through one integrated platform." Dad had looked at me like I'd suggested we start selling ice cream from a truck. "Nicole, construction is about relationships, not computers. You build trust with your suppliers, you shake hands on deals, you show up to the job site every morning. That's how real business works." But I couldn't let it go. The more I researched, the more I realized that logistics technology wasn't just the future. It was the present, and companies that didn't adapt would be left behind. So, I made a decision that scandalized Greenwich society and broke my parents' hearts. I dropped out of Yale Business School 6 months before graduation. The screaming match with Dad that followed still echoed in my memory 3 years later. "You're throwing away everything we've built for you," he'd shouted, his face purple with rage. "Yale, Trevor, your future, all for some ridiculous computer fantasy." "It's not a fantasy, Dad. It's innovation. It's the future." "The future?" He'd laughed bitterly. "You want to know what the future is? It's growing up, taking responsibility, and building something real instead of chasing these Silicon Valley pipe dreams." "Then I guess we'll have to agree to disagree," I'd said, trying to keep my voice steady even as tears streamed down my face. "If you walk out that door to chase this nonsense, don't expect to come crawling back when reality hits," he'd called after me. I'd turned around in the doorway of his study, looking at him surrounded by his construction awards and photos with mayors and governors. "I won't need to come crawling back, Dad. I'm going to build something so successful that you'll wish you'd believed in me." Famous last words, right? Except here I was, 3 years later, and I had done exactly that. AppFlow had started in a garage in Palo Alto, just me and my laptop, surviving on ramen noodles and the occasional freelance consulting gig. Those first 6 months were brutal. 18-hour days writing code, cold calling potential clients, getting rejected by every investor in Silicon Valley. There were nights I seriously considered calling Dad and admitting defeat. But then Marcus Webb had walked into my life. Marcus was a Stanford MBA with a trust fund, and more importantly, the business acumen I lacked. He'd seen the demo of my logistics platform at a tech meetup and immediately understood what I was building. "This isn't just software," he'd said over coffee the next morning. "This is infrastructure. You're not just solving supply chain problems, you're creating the backbone for how mid-size companies will operate in the digital economy." Marcus became my co-founder, bringing not just investment capital, but the kind of strategic thinking that turned my technical innovation into a viable business. We complemented each other perfectly. I understood the technology and the customer pain points, while he understood markets, funding, and scaling operations. The first year was still tough, but we started gaining traction. Small manufacturing companies, regional retailers, construction firms, they all had the same problem AppFlow solved. We weren't trying to compete with the massive enterprise software companies. We were serving the sweet spot of mid-market businesses that were too big for basic solutions but too small for custom enterprise implementations. By year 2, we had genuine momentum. We'd raised our Series A, hired our first employees, and moved into real office space in San Francisco's Soma district. Major companies were starting to notice us, and industry publications were writing about the AppFlow phenomenon. But the real validation came 6 months ago when TechFlow Industries approached us about an acquisition. TechFlow was a massive player in enterprise software, the kind of company that could take our platform and scale it globally. The negotiations took months, but when the final number came in, even Marcus was speechless. $68 million. $68 million. More money than Dad's construction company had grossed in its best 5 years combined. And here I was, sitting on a plastic chair because my parents were still ashamed of their dropout daughter. The party inside was hitting its peak now. Through the windows, I could see Dad in his element, silver-haired and commanding in his navy Armani blazer, gesturing animatedly to a circle of men in expensive suits. Richard Harrison, successful contractor, pillar of the Greenwich community, father of the disappointment currently sweating on his back patio. I recognized some of the faces from my childhood. Mr. Patterson from the country club, the Westcotts who lived 3 houses down, various business associates who'd watched me grow up and probably gossiped about my spectacular fall from grace. They were all there to celebrate Dad's latest triumph, securing the construction contract for a massive mixed-use development in downtown Stamford. It was a big deal, probably the largest project his company had ever undertaken. But even if it went perfectly, it would generate maybe $8 million in revenue over 2 years. I'd just sold my company for nearly 9 times that amount, and I was sitting outside like the family embarrassment. The French doors opened, and Trevor Whitmore III stepped onto the patio, looking every inch the Connecticut golden boy in his Brooks Brothers suit and Harvard Business School confidence. We'd broken up when I left for California, though it had been more of a mutual recognition that we wanted completely different lives than any dramatic confrontation. "Nick," he said, his voice carrying that slight note of condescension that I'd once found charming. "I heard you were back in town. How's the startup thing going?" "It's going well, Trevor. Really well." He sat down on the patio's stone ledge, careful not to wrinkle his suit. "That's great to hear. Dad was just telling me about some tech companies moving into the area. Maybe there's an opportunity for some traditional business partnership, you know? Bring some stability to the innovation." There it was. The assumption that my success was somehow incomplete without the validation of traditional Connecticut business. That I needed their approval, their partnership, their blessing to make what I'd built legitimate. "Actually," I said, checking my phone, "I think I'm doing just fine on my own." The notification on my screen made me smile for the first time all day. Marcus had texted, "ETA 2 minutes. Hope you're ready for this show." Trevor was still talking, something about market volatility and the importance of diversified investment strategies, but I wasn't listening anymore. In the distance, barely audible over the sounds of the party, I could hear it, the rhythmic thrum of helicopter blades cutting through the evening air. I stood up from that plastic chair, smoothed down my dress, and walked to the edge of the patio where I had a clear view of the sky. The sound was getting louder now, and I could see heads inside the house starting to turn toward the windows. Dad's animated conversation with his investors was beginning to slow as the rhythmic whopping filled the air, drowning out the string quartet he'd hired for the evening. The musicians actually stopped playing entirely, their instruments falling silent as everyone tried to figure out where the sound was coming from. "What's that noise?" Trevor asked, standing up and looking around confused. "That," I said, my smile growing wider as the sleek black Augusta helicopter appeared over the tree line, "is my ride." The helicopter circled the property once, giving everyone inside a perfect view, before beginning its descent toward the center of Dad's pristine lawn. I could see faces pressed against every window of the house now, and the party guests were starting to move toward the doors and windows to get a better look at whatever was happening outside. This was it. 3 years of exile. 3 years of building something extraordinary while my family told their friends I was going through a phase. 3 years of proving myself to everyone except the people whose approval I'd wanted most. The helicopter touched down with a gentle thud, its rotors whipping Dad's perfectly manicured grass into a frenzy. I had to hold my dress down as I walked across the lawn, the downwash from the blades making my hair dance wildly around my shoulders, probably ruining the careful styling I'd spent an hour on that morning. But I didn't care. For the first time in 3 years, I was coming home not as the family disappointment, but as exactly who I'd always said I would become. The helicopter's rotors were still spinning as I approached, my hair whipping around my face in the artificial windstorm. Through the cockpit window, I could see Marcus grinning like we'd just pulled off the heist of the century, while in the passenger compartment, 2 figures were preparing to disembark. The first person to step out was Sarah Chen, our lead investor, and the woman who just made us both very wealthy. At 53, Sarah was a legend in Silicon Valley venture capital, with a track record of identifying game-changing companies before anyone else. She was impeccably dressed in a charcoal Saint Laurent suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, but she moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd never had to prove herself to anyone. Behind her came David Morrison, CEO of TechFlow Industries and the man who'd just written us a check for $68 million. He was younger than I'd expected when we first met, probably mid-30s, with the kind of relaxed charisma that came from growing up wealthy and never having to question his place in the world. But unlike so many tech executives I'd met, David's confidence felt earned rather than inherited. Marcus finally emerged from the cockpit, pulling off his headset and straightening his tie. Even after piloting a helicopter, he somehow managed to look like he'd just stepped out of a boardroom. That was Marcus, unflappable in every situation, whether we were pitching to hostile investors or apparently making dramatic entrances at Greenwich Society parties. "Nick!" Marcus called out over the dying engine noise, jogging toward me with that infectious energy that had helped us survive the darkest days of building AppFlow. "How's the family reunion going so far?" "About as well as expected," I replied, gesturing toward the house where what seemed like 50 faces were pressed against every available window. They stuck me outside on a plastic chair because I was too much of a complication for Dad's important investors. "Well," David Morrison said, approaching us with Sarah close behind, his voice carrying easily despite the helicopter noise, "I think that chair's about to get a significant upgrade in status." The back doors of the house finally burst open, and the evening's entertainment was about to begin. Dad came striding across the lawn with Mom hurrying behind him, trying to keep up in her heels. His face was that particular shade of red I remembered from childhood, the color that meant someone was about to get a lecture about responsibility and proper behavior. But this wasn't childhood, and I wasn't the same person who used to shrink under that disapproving glare. "Nicole Marie Harrison!" Dad bellowed, his voice carrying that familiar tone of parental authority that had once been enough to make me abandon any argument. "What in God's name do you think you're doing landing a helicopter on my lawn in the middle of my party?" Mom had caught up now, frantically smoothing her silver hair and trying to regain some composure, despite the fact that her evening's carefully orchestrated social event had just been completely hijacked by aircraft. She was wearing her favorite Oscar de la Renta cocktail dress, the navy one with the subtle beading that she saved for the most important occasions. "Hi, Dad. Hi, Mom," I said calmly, my voice steady despite the fact that my heart was pounding. "I'd like you to meet some friends of mine. This is Marcus Webb, my business partner and co-founder of AppFlow. Sarah Chen, our primary investor and managing partner at Meridian Ventures. And David Morrison, CEO of TechFlow Industries." The introductions hung in the air for a moment, and I could see Dad's businessman instincts warring with his parental outrage. He recognized the names. Sarah Chen was regularly featured in Forbes and Fortune, and TechFlow Industries was exactly the kind of major corporation that Dad respected and aspired to work with. "Mr. Harrison," David stepped forward, extending his hand with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to making first impressions count. "I apologize for the dramatic entrance, but your daughter insisted on making this announcement in person. We've just completed the acquisition of her company for $68 million. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the helicopter's engines finally winding down completely. Dad's mouth opened and closed several times, his face cycling through expressions of confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been pride. Mom's grip on Dad's arm tightened visibly, her knuckles white against his navy blazer. Behind them, I could see the party guests streaming out of the house, drawn by curiosity and the promise of witnessing whatever family drama was about to unfold on the Harrison family lawn. 68, Dad started, then stopped, his voice barely audible. Million, I confirmed, unable to keep the satisfaction completely out of my voice. AppFlow just became TechFlow's newest subsidiary. I'm staying on as Director of Innovation, and we're planning to establish East Coast operations right here in Connecticut. Sarah stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been making deals like this for 2 decades. "Mr. Harrison, your daughter has built something truly remarkable. AppFlow's logistics management platform is revolutionary. It's going to change how mid-market companies operate their supply chains. That's why we knew we had to bring this company into the TechFlow family." I watched Dad process this information, and I could almost see the mental calculations happening behind his eyes. $68 million. More than his construction company had made in gross revenue over the past 5 years combined, and his dropout daughter had just become wealthier than most of the people at his party. The irony of the situation was settling in for everyone present. Here were Dad's investors, gathered to hear about his latest construction project, which, while significant for his company, represented maybe $8 million in revenue if everything went perfectly. Meanwhile, his estranged daughter had just landed on his lawn with a business deal worth nearly 9 times that amount. "Richard," called out Bill Patterson, one of Dad's longtime business associates, from the patio, "aren't you going to introduce us to your daughter and her associates? This is quite an impressive entrance." I could see Dad's internal struggle playing out across his face in real time. Part of him wanted to maintain his anger, to stick to the narrative that I was the family disappointment who'd thrown away a prestigious education for some foolish Silicon Valley dream. But another part, the businessman in him, recognized opportunity when it landed on his lawn via helicopter. Mom found her voice first, her hostess instincts finally overriding her shock. "Please, won't you come inside? I'm sure you must be tired after your flight. Can I offer you something to drink? We have champagne, or perhaps something stronger?" "Actually," Sarah Chen interjected with a polite but firm smile, "we can't stay long. We have a red-eye flight back to San Francisco tonight. But we wanted to deliver the news in person. It seemed important to Nick that her family hear about this directly from us." As we walked toward the house, I caught fragments of whispered conversations from the guests who'd gathered on the patio. Did they really say 68 million? That's Richard's daughter, the one who dropped out of Yale? I thought she was living in some garage in California. Harrison Construction doesn't even make that much in 5 years. The transformation was immediate and somewhat nauseating. These same people who had whispered about the Harrison family embarrassment at countless cocktail parties over the past 3 years were now craning their necks to get a better look at Greenwich's newest tech millionaire. Inside the house, the party had completely transformed into something entirely different from what Dad had planned. The investors who had come to hear about retail development and construction contracts were suddenly much more interested in hearing about technology, logistics, and Silicon Valley success stories. David Morrison, with his natural charm and obvious success, immediately became the center of attention. Within minutes, he was surrounded by a circle of fascinated listeners as he explained the acquisition. "Nick's platform has revolutionized how mid-size companies manage their supply chains," he was saying to the captivated audience. "The efficiency improvements we've seen in our beta testing are remarkable. Companies are reducing their logistics costs by 30 to 40%, while simultaneously improving delivery times and customer satisfaction. That's why we knew we had to bring AppFlow into the TechFlow family." One of Dad's investors, a sharp-looking woman in her 40s whom I recognized as Margaret Westbrook from Westbrook Capital, leaned forward with obvious interest. "And you're planning East Coast expansion? Here in Connecticut?" "Absolutely," David replied. "The talent pool here is incredible, and the business environment is very attractive for technology companies. We're looking at establishing our East Coast headquarters somewhere in the Fairfield County area." Dad's face was a study in conflicting emotions. Pride at having his daughter's success recognized by his peers, confusion about how this had all happened without his knowledge, and what looked like genuine curiosity about the business I'd built. I found myself standing in the living room where I'd grown up, surrounded by the same antique furniture and family portraits that had watched over my childhood, but feeling like I was in a completely different universe. The Persian rugs were the same. The oil paintings of various Harrison ancestors still hung in their gilt frames. But everything felt surreal. Marcus appeared at my elbow with 2 glasses of champagne, somehow having navigated the social dynamics of the room with his usual ease. "So," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the animated conversations happening around us, "how does it feel to be back home as the conquering hero?" "Weird," I admitted, taking a sip of the champagne, which I recognized as the good Krug that Dad only brought out for the most important occasions. "This morning, they were embarrassed to have me at their party. Now they can't stop talking about me. That's family for you," he said with a knowing smile. Marcus had grown up in a similar situation. Old-money Boston family who'd never quite understood his entrepreneurial ambitions. His grandfather had been a federal judge, his father ran a prestigious law firm, and Marcus was supposed to follow the family tradition of public service and legal excellence. Instead, he'd chosen technology and startups, much to his family's bewilderment. "The funny thing is," I continued, watching David effortlessly work the room, "I used to dream about this moment, coming home successful, proving them all wrong. But now that it's happening, it just feels hollow," Marcus suggested. "Not hollow, exactly. Just different than I imagined. I thought it would feel more like victory and less like, I don't know, Performance art? Before Marcus could respond, Mom approached us, looking slightly overwhelmed but clearly trying to process everything that had just happened. Her makeup was still perfect, but I could see the emotional exhaustion in her eyes. "Nick, sweetheart," she said, her voice carrying a note of wonder that I hadn't heard in years. "I had no idea your little computer business had become so substantial." "It's not a computer business, Mom," I explained patiently, the same way I'd tried to explain it 3 years ago. "It's logistics management software. We help companies optimize their supply chains, coordinate their operations, and reduce costs through better data analytics and process automation." She nodded as if she understood, though I could tell she was still processing the fundamental concept. Mom had always been brilliant with people and social dynamics, but technology had never been her strong suit. "And you're really worth all that money?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The company is worth that much, yes. But it's not just about the money, Mom. It's about building something meaningful, solving real problems for real businesses, creating jobs, and proving that innovation can come from anywhere, even from someone who dropped out of business school." Dad appeared beside her, and I could see he was struggling with something. His jaw was working the way it did when he was trying to decide whether to say something that might be difficult or uncomfortable. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Nick, I owe you an apology. I should have listened when you tried to explain what you were building 3 years ago. I was wrong to dismiss your ideas, and I was wrong to react the way I did when you decided to leave school." It wasn't a complete apology. There was no acknowledgement of the harsh words, no recognition of how they'd treated me tonight before the helicopter arrived, no admission that maybe his construction industry worldview wasn't the only path to success. But it was a start, and coming from Dad, it was more than I'd dared hope for. "Thanks, Dad," I said simply, not trusting myself to say more without getting emotional. "I'd like to hear more about this business of yours," he continued, his voice gaining strength as he found his footing in more familiar territory. "Maybe we could have lunch this week. I might even have some insights about East Coast expansion, local business climate, regulatory environment. And frankly, I'm curious about how construction and logistics technology might intersect." There it was. Classic Dad, already thinking about how he could be involved, how he could contribute his expertise, maybe even how he could take some credit or find some angle for his own business. But something in his voice was different this time. Less commanding, less dismissive, more genuinely curious about what I'd built and how it worked. "I'd like that," I said, and surprised myself by meaning it completely. Sarah appeared at my side, checking her elegant Cartier watch with the practiced efficiency of someone whose time was precisely scheduled. "Nick, I hate to break this up, but we really do need to head to the airport. David has an early morning meeting in Seattle, and I have a board meeting at 8 a.m. "Of course." I turned to my parents, feeling the weight of 3 years of separation and the possibilities of whatever came next. "I have to go, but I'll be back next week to start looking at office space. We'll have that lunch, Dad." Dad nodded, then did something that caught me completely off guard. He pulled me into a hug. A real hug, not the polite social embrace we'd exchanged at weddings and funerals, but the kind of hug he used to give me when I was little and had skinned my knee or had a bad day at school. "I'm proud of you, Nicole," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I may not have understood what you were doing, but what you've accomplished is remarkable." The next week passed in a surreal blur of phone calls, real estate tours, and family dinners that felt like I was living in some alternate version of my childhood. I'd taken a suite at the Greenwich Harbor Hotel, partly for convenience and partly because I wasn't quite ready to navigate the emotional complexity of staying in my childhood bedroom again. The hotel suite was elegant in that understated Connecticut way: pale blue walls, mahogany furniture, windows overlooking the harbor where sailboats bobbed at their moorings. It was the kind of place where I'd attended charity luncheons with Mom when I was in high school, back when my biggest concern was whether I'd get into Yale and whether Trevor would ask me to the country club's summer dance. Now I was sitting at the mahogany desk, fielding calls from reporters, real estate agents, and headhunters, trying to build the East Coast operations of a company I'd never imagined would grow this large. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was finally doing exactly what Dad had always wanted me to do, coming home to Connecticut to build a business. Except I was doing it on my own terms with my own success. My phone rang constantly. TechCrunch wanted an interview about the acquisition. Commercial real estate agents from Manhattan to Stamford were calling with prime office space. Executive recruiters were reaching out about key hires for the new operation. It was exhilarating and overwhelming at the same time. But the most important call came Tuesday morning, when Dad's assistant called to confirm our lunch at the Greenwich Country Club for Thursday. The Greenwich Country Club had been a fixture of my childhood. Tennis lessons, swimming lessons, the annual children's Christmas party where we all wore our best dresses and tried not to spill anything on the white tablecloths. It was where Dad had brought me as a teenager to show me off to his business associates, where I'd learned to navigate the subtle social hierarchies of Connecticut wealth. Walking into the main dining room on Thursday, I felt like I was stepping back in time. The same oil paintings of club founders lined the walls. The same heavy crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables of members conducting business over lunch. The maître d' recognized me immediately, though his expression suggested he wasn't sure whether to treat me as the successful entrepreneur I'd become or the wayward daughter he remembered. Dad was already seated at his usual table by the windows overlooking the golf course, wearing the navy blazer and club tie that was basically his uniform for important business meetings. He stood when he saw me approaching, and for a moment we both seemed uncertain about the appropriate greeting. Finally, he settled on a warm handshake and a pat on my shoulder. "You look good, Nick," he said as we sat down. "Success suits you." "Thanks, Dad. You look good too." And he did. The past week since the helicopter landing seemed to have energized him in a way I hadn't seen in years. We made small talk while we ordered. Dad got his usual club sandwich, I ordered the salmon, but I could tell he was working up to something more substantial. Finally, after the waiter had brought our drinks, he leaned forward with the focused intensity I remembered from childhood, when he was about to share some important business wisdom. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice carrying that measured tone he used when he was trying to work through a complex problem. "About East Coast expansion, about the opportunities here for technology companies. There's a lot of potential in this region, especially with the tax incentives Connecticut is offering to attract businesses." "I'm looking at spaces in Manhattan," I replied. "Better access to talent pools, closer to clients, more visibility in the market." "But have you considered Stamford?" Dad asked, his eyes lighting up with the enthusiasm he always showed when he'd found an angle others had missed. "Lower overhead costs, easier commute for employees who want to live in the suburbs, better parking, and the state would probably offer you significant incentives to establish operations there. Plus, you'd be close enough to Manhattan for meetings but far enough away to avoid the worst of the city's operational headaches." It was classic Dad, always thinking about the practical angles, the hidden costs, the long-term operational considerations that could make or break a business. But for the first time in years, I found myself actually listening to his advice instead of automatically rejecting it because it came from him. "That's actually not a bad idea," I admitted, and I could see the surprise and pleasure in his expression. "Marcus and I are touring some spaces in Stamford tomorrow, actually. The real estate market there is much more reasonable than Manhattan, and the talent pool from the local universities is pretty impressive." Dad smiled, the first genuine, unguarded smile I'd seen from him since the helicopter landing. "Good. And Nick, I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've accomplished. I may not have understood it at the time, and I definitely didn't handle things well when you left, but what you've built is remarkable." The admission hung between us, and I could see how much it cost him to say it. Dad had never been good at admitting he was wrong about anything, let alone something as fundamental as his assessment of his daughter's career choices. "Thanks, Dad. That means a lot. I've also been thinking about potential synergies between what you're doing and what we do," he continued, shifting into more comfortable business territory. "Construction project management has a lot of logistics components. Coordinating subcontractors, managing material deliveries, optimizing work sequences. I wonder if there might be applications for your technology in our industry." The conversation continued for another hour, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was talking to my father not as a disappointed parent, but as one business person to another. He asked intelligent questions about our technology, our client base, our growth strategy. I found myself explaining technical concepts and market dynamics, and he actually seemed to understand and appreciate the complexity of what we'd built. But the real breakthrough came when he started talking about his own business challenges. "The construction industry is changing faster than most of us want to admit," he said, his voice carrying a note of vulnerability I'd rarely heard from him. "Younger competitors are using technology to bid more aggressively, manage projects more efficiently. Some of my longtime clients are starting to ask about digital project management, real-time cost tracking, things I don't fully understand but clearly need to learn about." "Dad, those are exactly the kinds of problems AppFlow was designed to solve. Not for construction specifically, but for any business that needs to coordinate complex operations with multiple moving parts. Would you be willing to take a look at our operations sometime? Not as a favor, but as a potential business opportunity. If your technology could help us become more efficient, more competitive, it might be worth exploring a formal consulting arrangement." The request caught me off guard. 3 years ago, Dad had dismissed my ideas as computer fantasies. Now he was asking for my professional expertise to help save his business. "I'd be happy to take a look," I said. "No charge for the initial assessment. Family discount." He laughed at that, And for a moment, I caught a glimpse of the father I remembered from childhood, the one who used to take me to construction sites and explain how buildings were put together, who taught me that business was about solving problems and creating value for people. The lunch ended with plans to meet again the following week, and as I drove back to the hotel, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years. Genuine hope that my relationship with Dad might actually be repairable. That evening, I was having dinner with Mom at Le Bernardin, a quiet French restaurant in town that had always been her favorite for intimate conversations. Mom looked elegant as always in a silk blouse and pearls, but I could see the emotional exhaustion in her eyes. "Your father's been talking about you nonstop since that night," she said, cutting her soul into precise pieces with the methodical attention she brought to everything. "He's telling everyone about his daughter, the tech entrepreneur. Bill Patterson said he's never seen Richard so animated about anything." "And how do you feel about that?" I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Mom set down her fork and looked at me directly, her blue eyes, the same shade as mine, filled with something that looked like regret. "Honestly, I'm ashamed of how we treated you. Not just at the party last week, but when you left for California 3 years ago. We should have supported you instead of making you feel like you had to prove yourself to earn our love." The words hit me harder than I'd expected. I'd been prepared for Dad's business-focused pride, but Mom's emotional honesty was something I hadn't seen coming. "We were so focused on the path we thought you should take, Yale, marriage to Trevor, joining the family business, that we couldn't see the path you were actually choosing might be even better," she continued. "And when you succeeded without us, instead of being proud, I think we were embarrassed that our daughter had outgrown our understanding of what success looks like." "Mom, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," she interrupted, her voice firm. "I understand why you felt like you had to make such a dramatic entrance last week. We earned that. We made you feel like an outsider in your own family, and you had to prove you belonged here by landing a helicopter on our lawn." The conversation was interrupted by my phone buzzing with a text from Marcus. I glanced at it, expecting some routine business update, but the message made my blood run cold. "Emergency. Need to talk immediately. Can you come back to California tonight?" I looked up at Mom, who had noticed the change in my expression. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" "I'm not sure," I said, my mind already racing through possibilities. "I might need to fly back to San Francisco tonight. There's some kind of emergency with the business." Mom reached across the table and took my hand, her grip warm and steady. "Whatever it is, you'll handle it. You've built something remarkable, Nick. Don't let one crisis make you forget that." I squeezed her hand, grateful for the support, but increasingly worried about what was waiting for me in California. "I have to make some calls. Can we finish this conversation when I get back?" "Of course. And Nick, we want to be part of your life again, if you'll let us. Not just when things are going well, but especially when they're not." An hour later, I was in my hotel suite, frantically packing while on a conference call with Marcus. The details he shared made my stomach churn with a familiar startup founder's dread, the kind of crisis that could destroy everything we'd built. "There's been a security breach at TechFlow's main servers," Marcus explained, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "A major one. They think it originated from AppFlow's systems, possibly during the integration process after the acquisition." "How bad?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. "Bad enough that TechFlow's stock dropped 12% in after-hours trading when the news leaked. Bad enough that David Morrison is facing questions from his board about the AppFlow acquisition. Bad enough that our $68 million deal might be in serious jeopardy." The room seemed to spin around me. Everything I just rebuilt with my family, all the pride and acceptance I'd finally earned, all the vindication of my decision to leave Connecticut 3 years ago, it could all disappear as quickly as it had arrived. "Marcus, that's impossible. Our security protocols were bulletproof. We had 3 independent audits before the acquisition closed." "I know, but the initial forensics are pointing to our authentication modules as the entry point. David wants us back in California immediately. There's going to be a full investigation, and if they determine that our code was compromised..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. If AppFlow was responsible for a major security breach at TechFlow, we wouldn't just lose the acquisition money. We'd be facing potential lawsuits, regulatory investigations, and the complete destruction of our professional reputations. "Book us on the next flight out," I said, my mind already shifting into crisis mode. "And Marcus? Not a word to anyone here about this. Not yet. Already done. Red Eye leaves JFK at midnight. I'll pick you up at your hotel in 2 hours." I hung up and stared out the window at Greenwich Harbor, where the lights of expensive yachts twinkled in the darkness. 24 hours ago, I'd been the conquering hero returning home with unprecedented success. Now I might be heading back to California to watch everything I'd built collapse in real time. The helicopter entrance would look less like a triumphant return and more like the last hurrah before a spectacular fall. The red-eye flight to San Francisco felt endless, made worse by the fact that Marcus and I spent most of it hunched over our laptops, going through every line of AppFlow's security code with the desperate intensity of surgeons trying to save a patient's life. The cabin was dark around us, other passengers sleeping peacefully while we tried to figure out how our supposedly bulletproof system could have been compromised. "Look at this," Marcus said, pointing to his screen around 2 a.m, the authentication module we licensed from SecureFlow. It's the same one used by dozens of other companies, including 3 of TechFlow's existing subsidiaries. So if there was a vulnerability in that module, we wouldn't be the only ones affected, I said, feeling the first glimmer of hope since this nightmare had started. Exactly. But here's the problem. We were the most recent integration. If hackers exploited a vulnerability in SecureFlow's code, and that vulnerability was discovered during our integration process, we're going to look like patient zero even if we're just another victim. By the time we landed at SFO, we were exhausted and no closer to answers, but at least we had a better understanding of the potential scope of the problem. The early morning California sunshine felt surreal after the crisis mode intensity of the overnight flight. TechFlow's headquarters in Palo Alto buzzed with tense energy when we arrived. Employees were clustered in small groups, talking in hushed voices about stock prices and news reports. The usually casual atmosphere of the tech campus felt charged with anxiety and speculation. David Morrison met us in the lobby, his easy smile replaced by grim concern and the kind of exhaustion that comes from dealing with board members and crisis communications teams all night. "Nick, Marcus, thanks for getting here so quickly," he said, leading us toward the elevators. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this. The situation is serious. But before we get into the details, I want you to know that TechFlow isn't throwing AppFlow under the bus. We're treating this as a shared problem that we'll solve together." The relief I felt at those words was overwhelming. In startup world, acquisitions gone wrong often ended with the acquired company being blamed for every problem and the founders being quietly pushed out. He led us to a conference room where Sarah Chen was already waiting, along with TechFlow's chief technology officer, head of security, and what looked like half the company's legal team. The mood was somber as they laid out the details of the breach. "The attack happened 4 days ago," the security chief explained, pulling up a timeline on the wall-mounted display. "Someone gained access to our client database and downloaded information on approximately 53,000 customers, including names, email addresses, phone numbers, and in some cases, billing information." My heart sank. 53,000 customers. That was a massive breach by any standard, the kind that made national news and triggered regulatory investigations. The entry point appears to have been through a backdoor vulnerability in logistics management software that was recently integrated into our systems, he continued, and I braced myself for the accusation that would destroy everything we'd built. "However," he said, and that single word made me look up with desperate hope, "we've traced the actual vulnerability to a third-party authentication module manufactured by SecureFlow Technologies. This module is used not just by AppFlow, but by 47 other companies in our industry, including several of our existing subsidiaries." The room was silent as the implications sank in. We weren't the cause of the breach. We were just another victim. The hackers specifically targeted the SecureFlow vulnerability because they knew it would give them access to multiple companies' systems, the CTO added. "AppFlow wasn't the target, and you weren't negligent. You were just unlucky enough to be the most recent integration when they chose to exploit this particular security hole." The relief was overwhelming, but it was short-lived. David's next words brought me back to the harsh realities of crisis management. "The problem is perception," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of corporate politics and public relations nightmares. "When news of this breach gets out, and it will, probably by this afternoon, AppFlow's name is going to be mentioned in every story. The media loves a narrative, and major acquisition linked to security breach is exactly the kind of story that gets clicks and views. What are our options?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer would involve a lot of pain and very little glory. "We're going to have to be completely transparent," Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd navigated dozens of corporate crises. "Full disclosure about what happened, how it happened, what data was compromised, and what we're doing to prevent it in the future. It's going to hurt in the short term, but it's the only way to maintain long-term credibility with our clients and stakeholders." The next 72 hours were a masterclass in crisis management, the kind of intensive experience that either destroys companies or makes them stronger. We worked around the clock with TechFlow's PR team, legal department, and executive communications specialists to craft a response strategy that was honest but not alarmist, comprehensive but not overwhelming. The first challenge was crafting a public statement that accurately described what had happened without making AppFlow look like the villain. Every word was analyzed, debated, and revised multiple times. We had to explain technical concepts to a general audience, acknowledge the seriousness of the breach while emphasizing the steps we were taking to prevent future incidents, and somehow maintain confidence in both companies' futures. The second challenge was coordinating with affected clients. 53,000 customers had to be notified before the news went public, which meant thousands of phone calls, emails, and individual conversations with account managers who were just as shocked and concerned as their clients. The third challenge was managing the inevitable media circus. Tech journalists, business reporters, and cybersecurity experts all wanted statements, interviews, and exclusive access to the story. We had to balance transparency with strategic communication, giving enough information to maintain credibility while not revealing details that could compromise the ongoing investigation. But the hardest part, by far, was calling my parents. I waited until the second day of the crisis, when we had a clearer picture of the situation and our response strategy. I caught Dad at his office in Greenwich, interrupting what I could tell was a busy afternoon of his own business challenges. "Dad, I need to tell you something, and you're probably going to see it in the news over the next few days." I explained the situation as clearly as I could, emphasizing that AppFlow wasn't at fault, but would likely be mentioned prominently in news coverage. I tried to prepare him for the possibility that his friends and business associates might ask questions or make comments about his daughter's company being linked to a major security breach. There was a long pause after I finished explaining everything. "Are you okay?" he asked finally, and the genuine concern in his voice caught me off guard. "I mean personally, financially. Is this going to hurt you?" It wasn't the question I'd expected. I'd been braced for questions about his reputation, about what his country club friends would think, about whether this would reflect poorly on the Harrison family name. Instead, he was asking about me. "I'll be fine, Dad. The acquisition deal is still solid, and we'll get through this. But it might be a rough few weeks, and I wanted you to hear about it from me before you saw it on the news. Is there anything I can do to help?" The offer was simple and genuine, and it meant more to me than any of the professional support I'd been receiving from TechFlow's crisis management team. "Actually, yes. If anyone asks you about it, just tell them you're proud of how we're handling the situation, that we're taking responsibility for fixing the problem and making sure it doesn't happen again." "I can do that," he said without hesitation. "Because I am proud, Nick. This kind of crisis could destroy a smaller company, but from everything you're telling me, you're handling it exactly right. Taking responsibility, being transparent, protecting your customers, that's how you build long-term trust in business." When I called Mom later that evening, she had a similar response. Instead of worrying about social embarrassment or family reputation, she was concerned about my well-being and stress levels. "How are you sleeping?" she asked. "Are you eating enough? I know how you get when you're under pressure. You forget to take care of yourself." It was such a mom thing to say, but it also represented a fundamental shift in how my parents were relating to me. They weren't seeing me as a reflection of their success or failure anymore. They were seeing me as their daughter, period. When the story broke on the third day, it was as bad as we'd expected. "Major tech acquisition linked to security breach" was the headline in TechCrunch. AppFlow integration compromised TechFlow systems led the coverage in Wired. Our phones rang constantly with reporters wanting statements, investors wanting reassurance, and clients wanting explanations. But something unexpected began to happen as the full story emerged. The transparency strategy that had seemed so risky started to pay off in ways we hadn't anticipated. Other tech companies came forward with similar experiences with SecureFlow's authentication module. Industry analysts began praising our handling of the crisis, contrasting our immediate disclosure and comprehensive response with companies that had tried to hide or minimize similar breaches. Cybersecurity experts started using AppFlow as a case study in how to respond to a crisis with integrity. Within a week, instead of being seen as the company that caused a breach, we were being held up as an example of how to respond to an unavoidable crisis with professionalism and transparency. Marcus and I were in TechFlow's break room on the 6th day of the crisis, finally allowing ourselves to believe that we might actually survive this nightmare when David Morrison found us. "I wanted you both to know," he said, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him since this whole thing started, "that your handling of this situation has impressed everyone here. We knew we were acquiring a good company when we bought AppFlow, but we didn't know we were getting crisis management expertise as a bonus." "Does this mean we still have jobs?" Marcus asked with a tired smile. "More than that. The board met yesterday, and they want to expand your roles within TechFlow. We're thinking about making AppFlow the flagship operation for all of TechFlow's enterprise solutions. The way you've handled this crisis has shown us that you have the kind of leadership and integrity we want driving our growth strategy." It was more than I dared hope for. Not only had we survived the crisis, but we'd actually strengthened our position within TechFlow and earned the kind of trust and respect that usually took years to build. But even as I felt relief and gratitude for the professional outcome, I couldn't stop thinking about my parents and how they'd responded to the crisis. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like they were truly proud of me not for my success, but for my character. The aftermath of the security crisis brought an unexpected gift: clarity about what really mattered. Over the following months, as AppFlow evolved into TechFlow's flagship enterprise division, and I settled into my new role as Vice President of East Coast Operations, I found myself rebuilding not just business relationships, but family connections I'd thought were permanently damaged. The East Coast expansion moved faster than anyone had anticipated. Within 6 weeks of the crisis, we'd secured a lease on a spectacular office space in Stamford, a converted industrial building that Marcus had found, complete with exposed brick walls, floor-to-ceiling windows, and enough room for the 100 employees we planned to hire over the next 18 months. Dad had been right about Stamford. The talent pool was incredible. Engineers from Yale and MIT who wanted to work for a cutting-edge tech company without relocating to Silicon Valley. Business professionals from Manhattan who were tired of the commute and cost of living. Recent graduates from local universities who brought fresh perspectives and boundless energy. But the real surprise was how much I enjoyed the process of building something physical in addition to building something digital. Working with architects and contractors, designing office layouts that would foster collaboration and creativity, selecting furniture and technology that would create the kind of environment where innovation could flourish. It reminded me of being a little girl, watching Dad turn empty lots into shopping centers and office buildings. The grand opening of the new AppFlow East Coast headquarters was scheduled for a Friday in early December, and I'd invited my parents to be part of the ribbon-cutting ceremony. It felt important to have them there, not just as family, but as witnesses to what their support had helped me achieve. The night before the opening, I had dinner with both of them at a quiet restaurant in Stamford, just a few blocks from the new office. It was the first time in months that we'd all been together without the pressure of crisis management or family drama, and the conversation flowed more easily than it had in years. "I drove by the building yesterday," Dad said, cutting his steak with the methodical precision he brought to everything. "The renovation work is remarkable. Whoever your contractor was did an excellent job preserving the industrial character while creating a modern workspace." "Actually," I said, smiling at the opening he'd given me, "I was hoping you might consider taking on our next project. We're looking at expanding into a second building next year, and we'll need someone who understands both traditional construction and technology infrastructure." Dad's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a consulting contract. We need someone who understands local building codes, has relationships with quality subcontractors, and can manage complex construction projects on time and on budget. Plus, it might be interesting for you to work on projects that integrate traditional construction with cutting-edge technology requirements." The idea had been percolating in my mind for weeks. AppFlow was growing so fast that we'd outgrow our current space within 2 years, and Dad's construction company had the exact expertise we'd need for expansion. But more than that, it felt like an opportunity to bridge the gap between his world and mine in a way that honored both. That's a fascinating proposition," Dad said slowly. "I'd have to learn about your specific infrastructure needs, technology requirements, but the construction fundamentals would be the same." "Think about it," I said. "No pressure, but the offer's there if you're interested." Mom had been watching this exchange with obvious delight. "You know," she said, "this reminds me of when you were 8 years old and you insisted on helping your father build that treehouse in the backyard. You had your own little hard hat and everything." "I remember that," Dad said, his expression softening. "You were so determined to do everything exactly right. Measuring twice, cutting once, making sure every nail was perfectly straight." "Some things never change," I replied. "I'm still obsessive about doing things exactly right." The conversation was interrupted by my phone buzzing with a text from Marcus. "Last-minute disaster with catering. Can you come to the office?" I apologized to my parents and headed to the new AppFlow headquarters, where I found Marcus pacing in the lobby with the controlled panic that came from having 100 VIPs. "Arriving tomorrow and no food to serve them. The caterer just called," he explained as we walked through the space, checking last-minute details. "Their head chef is in the hospital with food poisoning, of all things, and they can't fulfill the contract." "What are our options?" "Limited. Most quality caterers are booked solid for December events. We might be able to get sandwiches from a deli, but that's not exactly the impression we want to make on TechFlow's board members and potential clients." I was about to suggest we delay the opening when my phone rang. It was Mom. "Nick, sweetheart, your father and I were just talking after you left. If you need any help with tomorrow's event, we'd be happy to pitch in. I know you said you had everything handled, but sometimes last-minute problems come up. Actually, Mom, you might be psychic. We just lost our caterer. Don't suppose you know anyone who could handle food for 100 people on 12 hours' notice? As a matter of fact, I do. Sarah Morrison, no relation to your David Morrison, runs the catering for most of the major events at the country club. She's incredibly good, and I know she sometimes takes outside contracts for special clients. Within an hour, Mom had not only contacted Sarah Morrison, but had convinced her to take on our event as a personal favor. By 10 o'clock that night, we had a full catering plan, complete with past hors d'oeuvres, a gourmet lunch, and what Mom assured me would be presentation that will impress even your Silicon Valley colleagues. The next morning, as I stood in the main conference room of our new headquarters watching the catering team set up elegant displays of food that looked like they belonged in a 5-star restaurant, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the ways my two worlds were finally coming together. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was everything I'd hoped it would be, and more. David Morrison flew in from California with several TechFlow board members. Sarah Chen came with a group of potential investors interested in other East Coast tech opportunities. Local politicians, business leaders, and what seemed like half of Fairfield County's tech community turned out to celebrate AppFlow's expansion. But the moment that mattered most to me was when I stepped up to the podium to address the crowd, and I could see my parents in the front row, beaming with pride. 18 months ago, I began, AppFlow was a small startup in a garage in Palo Alto. Today, we're opening our East Coast headquarters with plans to hire 100 people over the next year and serve as TechFlow's flagship enterprise operation. I paused, looking out at the crowd of employees, investors, family, and friends who had all played a role in making this moment possible. But success isn't just about growth numbers or revenue targets. It's about building something meaningful with people you trust, solving real problems for real clients, and creating opportunities for others to build their own success stories. I caught Dad's eye in the audience and smiled. It's also about recognizing that innovation doesn't mean abandoning everything that came before. The best new ideas often come from combining traditional expertise with cutting-edge technology, local knowledge with global markets, family wisdom with entrepreneurial ambition. After the ceremony, as the crowd mingled and networked and celebrated, Dad found me standing by the windows that overlooked Long Island Sound. "I've been thinking about your offer," he said without preamble, "about the consulting contract. And I'm interested, very interested. I think Harrison Construction could bring value to your expansion projects, and frankly, I think working with you would bring value to my business as well. We could learn from each other." It was more than I dared hope for. Not just professional collaboration, but mutual respect and genuine partnership. "There's one condition, though," he continued. "I want to do this right. No family favors, no special treatment. If Harrison Construction is going to work with AppFlow, we'll compete for the contracts on merit and deliver results that justify your confidence in us." "I wouldn't have it any other way," I said, extending my hand for a formal handshake. As we shook hands, I realized that this moment represented something I'd been trying to achieve for years without knowing it. Not just professional success, not just family reconciliation, but a genuine integration of all the different parts of my life into something coherent and meaningful. The helicopter entrance 8 months ago had been about proving myself to my parents. This handshake was about building something together. 6 months after the grand opening of AppFlow's East Coast headquarters, I stood in the glass-walled conference room on the top floor, looking out at Long Island Sound where early morning sailboats caught the spring breeze. The view never got old. The perfect blend of Connecticut's natural beauty and the bustling energy of a growing tech hub. AppFlow East Coast had exceeded every growth projection we'd made. We'd hired 83 people in our first 6 months, landed major contracts with 3 Fortune 500 companies, and become the anchor tenant that was attracting other tech companies to Stamford. The local business journals were calling it the AppFlow effect, and the mayor had asked me to serve on the city's economic development committee. But the real success was more personal and harder to quantify. Every Sunday, I had dinner with my parents. Not the formal dining room where they entertained their country club friends, but the kitchen table where we'd eaten when I was growing up. The conversations ranged from business strategy to family gossip to political debates. The kind of wide-ranging discussions that reminded me why I'd missed home so much during my years in California. Dad's construction company had just completed our second building renovation, transforming another industrial space into what would become AppFlow's Research and Development Center. The project had come in on time and under budget, and more importantly, it had given Dad a crash course in the infrastructure requirements of modern technology companies. "You know," he'd said over last Sunday's dinner, passing me the mashed potatoes with a grin, "when you first tried to explain logistics technology to me 3 years ago, I thought you were talking about some kind of science fiction. Now I'm installing server rooms and fiber optic networks like I've been doing it for decades. Some of the old dogs can learn new tricks, Mom had added, her eyes twinkling with affection for both of us. The integration of our professional lives had been surprisingly smooth. Dad's construction expertise gave AppFlow a competitive advantage in creating workspace environments that fostered both collaboration and productivity. My technology platform helped Harrison Construction optimize their project management and reduce costs on every job. We were proof that family business partnerships could work when based on mutual respect and complementary strengths. But today was special for a different reason. I was preparing for the biggest presentation of my career, the keynote address at TechFlow's annual conference in San Francisco, where I'd be speaking about crisis management, transparent leadership, and the future of enterprise technology. More importantly, my parents would be in the audience. The tickets I'd given them for Christmas were for front row seats, and I'd arranged for them to attend the VIP reception, where they'd meet other TechFlow executives, investors, and industry leaders. Marcus knocked on my conference room door, interrupting my pre-presentation nerves with his usual perfect timing. "Ready for your moment of glory?" he asked, settling into the chair across from my desk with 2 cups of coffee. Ready as I'll ever be. Although I'm more nervous about my parents being there than about addressing 3,000 tech executives. Why? They've seen you present before. Not like this. This is the biggest stage I've ever been on, and it's the first time they'll really see me in my element, doing what I do best in front of my professional peers. Marcus smiled knowingly. "You want them to be proud of you. I want them to understand me," I corrected. For 3 years, they knew I was successful, but they didn't really understand what that success meant or how I'd achieved it. This is their chance to see not just what I've built, but how I think, how I lead, how I've earned the respect of this industry. They're already proud of you, Nick. Anyone who spends 5 minutes with them can see that. I know, but this feels like completion somehow, like the last piece of a puzzle falling into place. The flight to San Francisco was smooth, and I spent most of it reviewing my presentation notes while my parents explored the first-class cabin with the wide-eyed curiosity of people who usually flew coach. Dad struck up a conversation with the businessman in the seat across the aisle, and within 20 minutes they were exchanging business cards and discussing potential collaboration opportunities. "Some things never change," Mom whispered to me, nodding toward Dad's impromptu networking session. "Put your father anywhere and he'll find someone to do business with." The TechFlow conference was held at the Moscone Center, the same venue where Apple held their product launches and where I'd attended my first tech conference as a starry-eyed startup founder 5 years earlier. Walking into the massive convention space with my parents, seeing their amazement at the scale and energy of the event, I felt a profound sense of how far I'd traveled, not just geographically, but personally and professionally. The conference was a showcase of everything I loved about the tech industry. Brilliant people solving complex problems, innovative companies pushing the boundaries of what was possible, and the infectious optimism that came from believing technology could make the world better. But it was also a reminder of how much I'd learned about the importance of grounding innovation in human values and real-world wisdom, the kind of lessons I'd absorbed growing up in Connecticut, watching Dad build relationships with clients and employees, watching Mom navigate complex social dynamics with grace and intelligence. The VIP reception the night before my keynote was held on the rooftop of a downtown hotel, with stunning views of San Francisco Bay and the Golden Gate Bridge. I introduced my parents to David Morrison, Sarah Chen, and dozens of other tech luminaries, watching with amusement, as Dad immediately began asking intelligent questions about market strategies, and Mom charmed everyone with her genuine interest in their work. "Your parents are delightful," Sarah told me during a quiet moment. "Your father's questions about construction technology applications are actually quite insightful. Has he ever considered consulting for other tech companies?" "Funny you should ask," I replied. "He's been talking about expanding Harrison Construction's services to include technology infrastructure projects. Put us in touch. We're always looking for contractors who understand both traditional construction and modern tech requirements." Watching my parents navigate the reception with confidence and curiosity, I realized that the gap between their world and mine had never been as wide as I'd thought. They'd always had the intelligence, integrity, and interpersonal skills that made for success in any industry. The only difference was the context and the technology. The morning of my keynote, I woke up in my hotel room with the familiar combination of excitement and terror that came before any major presentation. But as I got dressed and reviewed my notes one final time, I felt a calm confidence that surprised me. The presentation wasn't just about crisis management or technology innovation. It was about the integration of all the lessons I'd learned, from my parents about integrity and perseverance, from Marcus about strategic thinking and partnership, from the tech industry about embracing change and thinking big, and from my own experience about the importance of staying true to your values, even when the stakes are highest. Walking onto the stage at Moscone Center, looking out at 3,000 faces in the audience, I found my parents in the front row exactly where I'd arranged for them to sit. Dad gave me a subtle thumbs up, and Mom blew me a discreet kiss. 18 months ago, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the vast space. AppFlow faced the kind of crisis that destroys companies and ends careers. A security breach that threatened not just our acquisition deal, but our reputation, our relationships with clients, and everything we'd worked years to build. I paused, making eye contact with audience members across the massive auditorium. Today, I want to talk about what we learned from that crisis and how the experience taught us that true success isn't about avoiding failure. It's about how you respond when failure finds you anyway. The next 45 minutes flew by as I shared the story of the security breach, our response strategy, and the lessons we'd learned about transparent communication, taking responsibility, and building trust through adversity. But more than that, I talked about the importance of having a foundation of values and relationships that can sustain you through any crisis. Innovation is important, I said as I approached the conclusion, but innovation without integrity is just clever manipulation. Growth is important, but growth without purpose is just accumulation. Success is important, but success without the people you love to share it with is just an impressive resume. I looked directly at my parents as I delivered the final lines. The most important lesson I've learned is that you don't have to choose between honoring where you came from and pursuing where you want to go. The best innovations often come from combining traditional wisdom with cutting-edge thinking, local knowledge with global ambition, family values with entrepreneurial drive. The standing ovation lasted almost 3 minutes, but the moment that mattered most to me was seeing the tears in Mom's eyes and the pride on Dad's face as they applauded with everyone else. Later that evening, at the conference's closing dinner, I found myself sitting between my parents at a table full of tech executives, investors, and entrepreneurs. The conversation ranged from artificial intelligence to sustainable energy to the future of work, and I watched with delight as my parents contributed insights and asked questions that showed they understood not just the business implications, but the human impact of technological change. I have to admit, Dad said during a lull in the conversation, when Nick first told me she was dropping out of business school to start a computer company, I thought she'd lost her mind. And now? Asked Jennifer Wu, a venture capitalist who'd been following AppFlow's growth with interest. Now I think she was the only one in the family who hadn't lost her mind, Dad replied with a laugh. She saw the future more clearly than any of us, and she had the courage to bet everything on her vision. After dinner, as we walked through downtown San Francisco toward our hotel, Dad suddenly stopped on a quiet side street. Nick, I need to say something, and I should have said it a long time ago. I turned to face him, surprised by the serious tone in his voice. I'm sorry, not just for not supporting you when you left school, but for making you feel like you had to choose between our approval and your dreams. You shouldn't have had to land a helicopter on our lawn to get us to take you seriously. Dad, we've already... No, let me finish. You were right about everything. About technology, about innovation, about the direction business was heading. But more than that, you were right to follow your instincts even when everyone around you thought you were crazy. That takes a kind of courage I'm not sure I would have had at your age. Mom linked her arm through both of ours as we continued walking. What your father is trying to say, she said with a smile, is that we've learned as much from you as you've learned from us. Maybe more. As we reached the hotel lobby, I felt a completeness that had nothing to do with professional achievements or financial success. The helicopter entrance a year ago had been about proving myself to my parents. This weekend had been about building something together. Not just a business relationship, but a genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared values. So, Marcus said, appearing beside us with his usual perfect timing, how does it feel to have conquered Silicon Valley? I looked at my parents, both beaming with pride and excitement about everything they'd experienced over the past few days. And then at Marcus, who'd been my partner through every triumph and crisis of the past 5 years. It feels like coming home, I said, finally. But the truth was more complex and more satisfying than that simple phrase could capture. I hadn't just come home to Connecticut or conquered Silicon Valley. I'd found a way to integrate all the different parts of my life, family and career, tradition and innovation, local roots and global ambition, into something coherent and meaningful. The plastic chair they'd stuck me in outside Dad's party had been a symbol of exclusion, of being treated as an outsider in my own family. But the path from that chair to this moment had taught me that true belonging isn't about conforming to other people's expectations. It's about being authentic enough, successful enough, and secure enough in your own values that you can build bridges between different worlds without losing yourself in the process. As we rode the elevator up to our rooms, I thought about the little girl who used to help Dad build tree houses, who learned about business relationships from watching Mom navigate social dynamics, who was raised to believe that integrity and hard work would eventually be rewarded. That little girl had grown up to build something remarkable, not by abandoning the lessons of her childhood, but by finding new ways to apply them in a rapidly changing world. And maybe that was the real definition of success. Not just achieving your goals, but doing it in a way that honors both where you came from and where you're going, with the people you love most cheering you on from the front row.